Hi everyone, I'm Lorna from Redocly. We do not just documentation, but cool documentation tooling, cool API tooling, a bunch of other things. But today I am here to talk about docs, here to talk about DevOps your docs, because I thought that if I took an invented noun and used it as a verb in my talk title, I would definitely make friends with documentarians immediately. So let's talk about DevOps and how it relates to your docs. The two halves, the dev and the ops, bring different things, and I think they both have a lot to give us. The developer side, the software development, brings us source control and some really great coding tools that were invented or made to work on source code, which work really well on documentation as well. The operations side gives us culture, or I often say attitude, of making things a little bit better, making sure they stay better, and then making things a little bit better again. So this approach of continuous improvement and having fast feedback, making sure that we very quickly find out if we are meeting all of our goals or not, and we do that by running some of those tools automatically. So I want to cover a bunch of those things in today's session and also try to give you things that you can use and learn no matter where you are on this journey. Before we dive into it, I want to acknowledge that there are some prerequisites that you will need in order to use the content of this talk. First of all, you must be using text-based markup. So content as code, we talk about docs as code, it might be diagrams as code, but it all has to be stored in text-based files so that we can use those coder tools. There are lots of benefits to this. I love having content separate from presentation. There's no restyling weird things when the company gets bought or rebranded. The content is just the content, and the presentation is somebody else's department. And you might reuse that content in a bunch of different settings. The text-based markup opens up all sorts of tools in terms of finding things, formatting things, spell checking things. It's a world of wonder. The other thing you need is source control. Git is the best collaboration tool on the planet. I am not given to absolutes, but this is how I see it. You have this full audit of all the changes. If you work in any industry where you have compliance requirements, or it matters that you can tell what was live on the website on any given day, then this is the tool that will give you that just for free. Reviewing your changes, having those pull requests, that safe alternative universe to work in until a thing is ready without needing to copy things out of the way and then put them back when you're ready or send exports to people. Git gives us all of that, and it lets us safely work on a lot of different changes, whether that's because there are a lot of people in your team working on different things, or you are working on a lot of different things, like that seems a common tech writer story, then you can do that very safely. So you can start making one bunch of changes and still fix some other stuff and come back to it really easily. A lot of the magic in the docs as code workflow comes from automation, comes from having tools that run automatically as part of our source control flow with our text-based markup. And the way that I think about the process is really like this. So we start on the left, we're running the tool locally, whichever a tool might be, a spell checker or some kind of heading formatter, something that you can just run very quickly. It will let you know if there's a problem. It might also fix it. When you have finished your local changes and that pull request is open for review, we also have all of the tools available there, and they run automatically. So this is where the automation comes in. Every pull request has the same set of quality checks applied to it, and we control what those things are going to be, and we'll talk more about tools in a moment. But because we've done those checks, as well as having the human reviews, then we can publish with confidence. And that's really what automation brings to us. You're not hoping that the edits that team did haven't broken anything in the section that the other team owns. There is none of that. We can run the tools that check everything is okay. This might sound like a wonderful fairy story, something that belongs in someone else's professional setup, but I am going to try today to bring you advice that you can use yourselves in your teams. I do want to acknowledge that if you haven't worked in a team that works like this, it's really hard to set this stuff up from scratch, but I think it is achievable. I'm going to try and give you some advice on doing it, and there are lots of resources out there. So if this sounds like something you want to try, I'm here to tell you to try it, and I'm going to try and give you some advice on how to do it. So how does it begin? You pick a tool that runs anywhere. It needs to run on your computer, on your colleague's computer who has a different operating system, and it needs to run somewhere in the cloud when you open a pull request. It doesn't have to be a command line tool, but a lot of the time it will be, because those are tools that are intended to run anywhere, and usually play nicely with the cloud part of the story. A lot of these tools will also be open source, and Redocly publishes some of those. They don't have to be, but a lot of the tooling that is in your sort of DevOps type setup will be open source, and that's a great place to look. It means you don't have budget in order to be able, you don't need to have a big budget in order to be able to try things, but you do need to take the time to try to set things up. I feel like that was a tangent. You've picked your tool. I'm intentionally not making tool advice here. There are just too many of them. Look for what works with whatever documentation platform you are using and the tech stack that is most prevalent within your organization. Something that's been updated locally, you can't go far wrong. And it's not that difficult to switch the tools out if you change your mind later. So we picked a tool. You're going to run this tool locally because it works locally. We've picked something that runs everywhere, and set up some configuration. My advice here is to be as unambitious as you can bear. Do not read all of the docs for the tool and turn on everything you wish you had, especially in an existing documentation project. It's too much. Every build will fail. Every collaborator will be discouraged. I advise a little bit goes a really long way, and then it's a foundation to build on. So configure as few checks as you can manage and get this working and accepted right throughout the workflow, and then come back and add things. So you're running it locally. You've made some very minimal configuration. Now take that configuration, and it is usually a config file of some kind. Put the config in the repository and add the instructions either to the contributing file, to your internal wiki, like whatever makes sense to you. If you can do the first 3 steps, I think you are DevOps. Yeah, you are achieving a lot. Everybody can run this tool. Everybody will be using the same configuration because it's in the repository. So even if you change it, they will get the updates. But for the magical multiplier, you are going to automate this for every pull request. Now, we're going to do this with continuous integration, but you will sometimes hear it called continuous deployment. They're kind of separate things. Continuous integration, running the automation on a pull request. Continuous deployment, when you merge your pull request to the main branch or the master branch, then we immediately deploy it. Deploys continuously whenever something changes. It's a very common approach for SaaS software, pretty common for docs as well. But if you hear that terminology, CI, CD, we mean this. Check if there's an existing integration. I often use GitHub and GitHub Actions. It has a marketplace. Some of the common tools have actions that you can just immediately use. Otherwise, you're going to use a standard template and put the command that you're using locally, but remember it runs anywhere, into the configuration for that. Usually the config is in the repository, so the project itself knows what its continuous integration steps are. So you make that change on a branch, test that it works, now test that it fails. Because we need it to fail in the expected way. So if you're adding a spell checker, misspell a word, commit that to your branch and check that the thing that you thought should happen does actually happen. It amazes me how often I have not quite got this right. So this is the time to test that. When you merge this pull request with the new continuous integration stuff in it to the main branch, go and update the docs. Write down what's included, the why you chose it and the problem that it solves. And then we can always look back at that. This is ideal if your team grows or responsibilities change, but also just maybe you've slept since the last time you looked at this setup. So these notes are for future you as well. Next, let's look at an example. All very well me saying, oh, just add it into your CI. This is an example. It's a real one. Redocly makes a CLI tool that does OpenAPI linting. So this is Redocly's CLI, linting an OpenAPI file. The command that I use locally is the last line in this configuration file. The point that I'm trying to make is this is not a magical, mysterious secret. It's actually 12 lines of YAML. It's, as I heard it called recently, it's not rocket surgery. You can read this. There are lots of resources around there, and you can write it as well. And you can, there's lots of copy paste examples, lots of great documentation, lots of people share their setup. If there are open source documentation platforms, you can go and look at how their stuff is set up. This is GitHub Actions. The others are along the same lines. Say what you want to do, put the setup steps, add the command that is special and references the config. That's the basic idea. And this is a whole real action. We genuinely use this. I'm not simplifying it. Did make the font a little bit smaller, so I hope it's okay. When you're working on this kind of setup, there are some things that I think can be surprising if you're coming to this for the first time. I am an engineer by trade. I'm a software developer. I just like to write, and that's how I ended up here. But there are a few things that might be weird if that's not your background. Again, they shouldn't be secrets. We've just forgotten to make it easy for normal people, and I am going to attempt to do that now. First of all, think about whether if this check fails, if this tool reports a particular problem, is it a showstopper? Should we stop deployment and mark it as a failure immediately? Or is it something that we need to know about but we could continue with? All of these tools will have some sort of severity setting. It's usually error or warning. Sometimes there are more levels. And you just need to think about, for each thing, is this an error or is it a warning? For example, if there is a page that references an image but the image isn't there in the repository, that's an error. I do not want to deploy a piece of documentation that references an image, but the image isn't there. Stop, fix it. However, if I have an image in my repository, but it's not actually used in any of the pages, that could probably be a warning. I can deploy like that. Maybe I've added a new screenshot or removed the section that referenced this image. I do need to clean that up. I do want to know about it, but it's not worth not deploying for. We can carry on and fix this later. One really weird thing, for newcomers is that when you run a command line tool, if it completes successfully and you are brilliant and everything is wonderful, you will receive no output at all. Because no news is good news. The way that I think about this is that the command line tools are just very, very grumpy. If there's a problem, they will absolutely let you know. But if there's no problem, you're not going to get compliments. The status codes are the same. Every command finishes with like an exit code. If everything has gone well, the code is 0. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but it means there is no error. There's no error code to tell you. So 0 means success. But that might not be what you were expecting if you haven't used these tools before. Do write things down. Write down why we're doing it. Write down what it does. Link out the tools, and that sort of DevOps culture of having really good records so that anyone in the team can have the same knowledge as the person who set this up and could maybe take on the baton and make the next set of improvements. It's a really key skill because we're looking at being excellent and being more excellent over time. One golden rule with automation is you must never ignore a failing test. I'm not being superstitious, it's not bad luck, it's genuinely bad practice. Do not learn to ignore a problem in your pull request build. If it's okay to deploy with it broken, turn off the test. If you can ignore the test, you don't need it, turn it off. It's not giving you value. That build should be green and you should feel confident. If you get in the habit of, that test is a bit flaky, we often see a failed build, one day you're going to merge with a failed build because you just assumed it was probably that and actually something else is broken. So never ignore the failing test. Turn it off, disable it for now. I don't mind, but do not ignore. Fix the thing would be awesome. Do not ignore this failing test. It's very, very important that if you put this stuff in, you absolutely live by it because that's what it's there for. Let's look at some specific examples of some tooling. These are my favorites. I have used all different tools on a bunch of different documentation projects over the years for employers, for open source, for various other side projects. This is kind of the common theme of things that I usually like to include. I definitely didn't mention everything, so please tell us about the thing that you use that I didn't just say, because I think there's a bunch of cool ideas that I'd like to hear about. The first thing that I always add is checking links, partly because I do this wrong all the time. I am a professional at this. I literally get paid to work on documentation platforms, and I just can't link one page to another reliably. So having a tool like this is just brilliant, especially because we can sometimes be working under pressure. Redocly is just launching something. We're making a lot of edits. I sometimes move whole sections around, particularly pre-launch, and having a way of knowing that all of those links are fine is incredibly valuable. With link checking, you've got a couple of options. One is to check your source material, so check the ASCII doc or the restructured text or the markdown or whatever before you render the static site or whatever your PDF, whatever your output is. The other is to check afterwards and check in the output format that all of the lists work. If you have a super complex build where a lot happens between the source and the output, I'd be tempted to do both. Honestly, I have done both in the past, but right now I am usually just checking in the markdown that the links work within the site. I only check internal links, and I would recommend that you do the same, only checking internal links or links to other platforms owned by your company. Because if another site goes down, you do not want to spend their downtime with your builds failing. I do have another automation that that periodically checks all of the links, but it can be pretty slow to check all of the external links on a big docs platform, and a lot of the time it will be outside of your control. So my recommendation is this should be limited to internal links, and the other advantage is this is super fast because it just needs to check on the local setup. Doesn't need to go out lots of slow web calls. Let's talk about validation and formatting. Even though the markup formats that we use for docs are pretty lightweight, I mean, Markdown is barely a markup format in the first place. We're using MarkDoc now. I love restructured text. I have written books in ASCII doc. I do write LaTeX. I'm not really great with DocBook. There are lots and lots of options. Having syntax checking, did you get the brackets the correct way round on that Markdown image that you just added? And validating that everything is as it should be is super valuable, and I thoroughly recommend it. I also recommend that you do more than just validation, that your validation rules are quite opinionated and more like the software developers' coding standards. They use coding standards because code is much easier to read when it has a very consistent layout. That's true for us as well. If everything is always indented correctly, if the headings always have the space after, if the tables are always laid out in the same way, you can work with that source material much, much more easily. And there are lots of tools to make automatic validation and formatting easy. These are technically two different things. Validation checks if everything's okay and reports, and formatting will try to make everything okay and just tell you if there's something that you can't fix. Some tools do both, so it's quite a fuzzy difference. I really like to validate everywhere, locally and in the pull request, and report on problems, but I do have formatting tools that I can run locally. And that's really valuable because it means that I can very easily fix things, but I'm still reviewing that diff before I commit the changes that the formatter made. Don't really like having that automated. Make sure you're using tools that work locally and in continuous integration. A lot of the time, the stuff that you add in CI, you can put the same configuration into whatever your editor is, your IDE that you're using, if you use like a programmer's editor. So you can often this is just in the context of your editor as you're working, and I find that that's a very short feedback loop, and a great way to just not really think about it a lot. It's just that right there all the time. Docs as code, preview builds are one of many reasons that I just never want to go back. I think every pull request should build a preview. And there are just so many benefits. And if you're using a static site generator, a lot of the time this comes almost out of the box. Having a preview when you open a pull request means you know that the site actually builds with this set of code, which is a really good thing to know. I'm a big fan. It gives you a preview version to share with stakeholders. None of this fighting about what's currently on the staging server, a single staging version or not. Every change gets its own preview. And you can put a couple of pull requests together into another pull request if you do need to show things in combination, but you can work on those things separately, and that is so useful. I use previews for reviewing. If I see a small change come through and the diff feels manageable, I will just have a look at the preview that it rendered correctly and is exactly as I expect. And that's enough for me to approve a really small pull request change. The new Redocly cloud platforms have side-by-side reviews. So you see the old version and the new version as like a visual review comparison. And that's really neat as well. I'm sure that if you have this, you probably open the old one in the other tab sometimes. It's that, but like built in. Having previews just avoids surprises in the build process. I really value that. Let's talk about Veil. Veil is quality assurance for the written word. It is a prose linter. So you write rules or discover them on the internet. There's a lot of good resources around. And you use those rules to apply to all of your documentation platform and make sure that everything looks okay. If you've never used Veil before, you are definitely going to come away from this talk feeling that you don't know what Veil does, and that's because Veil does everything. Here's an example of it finding a future tense in a pull request. This is actually my pull request because I don't like to embarrass other people in my slides. We have a lot of contributors to our docs. Some are open source, but a lot are our internal developers and engineering teams as well. None of them are native English speakers. They're going to open the pull request. This is a level of immediate feedback that we can do programmatically even before one of the writers reviews. We have a rule that we do not use present tense. We do not use future tense in our docs, and Veil can check that for us. Other things I like to have Veil do, checking spellings, checking common misspellings. There are a few things where, that might be a valid word, but it's almost definitely not what you use. I used to work for a company that had an Apache Flink project mentioned regularly in its docs, and in the end we banned use of the English word flick and made it a misspelling of flink. You don't need the English word flick in technical documentation, or you could think of an alternative, and every instance of it we had misspelled a product name, but because it's a valid English word we couldn't spot it. There we go. So spellings and misspellings are very common. As well as spellings, it can also do common jargon, extra words, product names with correct capitalization, including GitHub, which has an extra capital letter in the middle of the word. If you need to have the trademarks in there, it can do all of that. It can identify repeated words. This is a rule that I quite like to have turned on. And Latin terms, couldn't resist the etc. at the end, because there are a lot of other things that it does. It can do substitutions, so it can recommend that if you say docs, you probably mean documentation, and if you say config, you probably mean configuration, and that can really help to make documentation and voice seem consistent on a site where you have a lot of contributors. In particular, I really prefer stuff this way over like a big style guide that probably nobody's read, or you have to keep looking things up. Veil can implement a lot of those rules for us, and I find it very valuable. Whether you use title case or sentence case in your headings, I am not judging you, but you need to be consistent, and Veil can catch that. This is something that I have valued enormously, especially where I've had a lot of external contributors to a docs site. I want to close a little bit by talking about the promise of Docs as code and how the DevOps tooling and these changes can be achievable. They don't come out of the box. It's really important that you recognize there will be some investment needed from you. Even with a budget of 0, you are going to invest time and energy. You're going to invest in your local platform. You are going to take time to set things up, to make yourself more productive and your team more productive. When things break on your local platform or need updating, you are going to prioritize the work to update and to fix them when they don't work. Look for allies in the technical departments if this isn't your superpower, because everything here is pretty transferable, and so your engineering allies can help in a way that they can't when you're using tooling that they don't know well. You can use a programmer's editor. If you do not want to write raw Markdown or raw ASCII doc or whatever, then you can find a rich editor with a nicer GUI interface and stuff to click on if that is how you do your best work. It's very important that you have a live preview. You can see what you're making. And it's also really important that all of the tools in your continuous integration are available to you and running locally. You should not have to push to check if you've fixed a problem yet or not. DevOps is all about culture and people, and honestly, I think documentation is as well. When we look to improve our practice, we're looking to be more productive, more excellent, more successful, just more awesome at what we do. And this is a real productivity hack, right? It's about setting things up that are going to have your back and let you do the stuff that really needs a human to do it. Invest in the skills. You're already here at Write the Docs, so perhaps I'm preaching to the choir, but look out for courses, books, events, other resources. Make it a culture of learning more about your craft and sharing those resources with others within the team. And if you don't have others, then the Write the Docs community is here for you. You can share things with us and we will nerd out with you about all of the documentarian things. All of us can find time to raise our game, to research the next tool, to time box an hour for a little bit of setup, or to reconfigure your editor with a new plugin that you just heard about. I have seen technical writers operate some of the most bizarre and arcane tooling I have ever seen in software. I do not at all buy it that anything in this setup, including Git, is too technical for any of you. Yes, there's a learning curve. Yes, it's not free, it's not instant, but I have seen what you can achieve and I know that you can achieve this. It's all a transferable skill as well. So the stuff that you learn now, you'll take with you all the way through your career. I am going to wrap it up there. I'm going to leave you with some resources and we're going to have some Q&A afterwards. So please come and chat to me. I would love to hear your experiences and tackle any of your questions that I can. And I'm also always around in the community and happy to hear from you all. Thanks for listening.
Okay, hello everyone and welcome to our Q&A session. Thank you for that great talk, Lorna. It's one of my favorite topics because I have a software engineering background. And yeah, we're happy that you're here. Thank you.
I'm excited to be here and what an honor to open the show.
Yes, and you got so many questions. Should we just dive right into this?
Let's do that.
Perfect. Okay. This first question is one that selfishly I was super interested in because I work in telecom. So if you're in an environment where most of the documentation is in Word documents or Excel sheets or PDFs, basically people aren't really familiar with like Docs as code or command line, Git. Would you recommend maybe like trying to move the organization towards that Docs as code approach, or how would you approach that?
This is a great question, and it's such a tricky situation because, you know, I have my favorite set of tools, but everybody's context is different, and context really, really matters, right? So I think it depends a little bit where in the process it needs to be. So if you've got a bunch of skilled writers who can manage with the more modern tools and you've got good dev support, like you've got an engineer that can help you with some of the setup, or you have those skills in the same team, then you can make the change if the output has to be PDF or the output has to be, the reports have to be delivered in Word format, then you can do it that way. If you need to collaborate in Word format, honestly, the pain of tracking changes backwards and forwards between, you know, a more precise setup is probably not worth it. And you are probably stuck until such time as, you know, we need to be efficient. I feel like there's a lot of teams now, either writers working on their own or teams that are much reduced in terms of the size of the team, but not reduced in terms of the size of the workload. And so something like Docs as code can give you a bit more efficiency because you're not reformatting or going slow with accepting changes. But yeah, it has to fit your organizational context, and there are times it does not fit.
Sort of related. So if you want to get some of, even if it's like you're not going to change the whole organization, you're not going to move everything to Docs as code. if you want to maybe just start getting people like introduced to the topic and you want to be able to maybe like do some learning sessions with your colleagues, is there like a particular component that you found for like less technical colleagues to be able to kind of ease them in, get them used to it? And that's where
I
you can
think a
start.
really good local setup can go a super long way. I'm a Vim user. I use Git from the command line. Partly I have some accessibility issues, partly I've just been an engineer for a really long time. That's my safe space. But I like to take the time to set people up with things like GitHub Desktop. One of the rich IDEs, I use VS Code. There are lots of others. You can even run that in the cloud, and there's lots of great training resources as well. So people can genuinely level up. There are lots of resources on how to do specifically writing with Git and GitHub or with another Git platform. So I like to try to make that as approachable as possible. And even, if you have someone who really doesn't want to write raw markdown, there are some nice rich text formatters out there, but the Git theory is unavoidable. You do need to invest a little bit in the skills for that.
Oh, I can like +1 the recommendation for GitHub Desktop. I now work on a product team and I found out product managers love it. It has that visual feedback, but you're still getting that kind of Git experience. So yeah. And then relatedly, one of our other top questions was, do you have any like, or can you recommend any specific like starting resources, books, influencers, platforms that you've seen? Like, because you've mentioned that there's a lot of content out there, but maybe where people can start looking for it.
This is tricky because it feels so specific to your platform. I think
Absolutely.
find out like, what do you use for continuous integration at your organization? Are you on Jenkins? Do you use Circle CI? Are you using GitLab functions? Like, find out what that is and start with the learning materials from those platforms, because if you're not familiar with the CI side, those are the automation is the piece that you are learning. If you're new to Git, there are some good resources around. If your employer gives you access to any of the online learning platforms, actually those are a really great place to start as well. And to some extent, it depends on your learning style. Like, I like to start from the README of the tool I would like to use next. But I have a colleague who's very theory based, and so we have to kind of start with like, let's think about what the problem is, understand it fully, and then we can implement it. So you all know how to drive your own brains. So there's a little bit of like looking around and finding things. If you have a local DevOps meetup or a platform engineering meetup in at some of the different cities, this can be quite an approachable way to learn a bit more about that mindset and to just pick up small things. So I would recommend that too.
Oh, absolutely. And if you're not working on an engineering team, I would definitely recommend like looking at what, if they have any learning platforms, like you mentioned, like a lot of teams use something like O'Reilly, and like those platforms have a ton of materials about these topics. And then, we have so many questions, but unfortunately we're running out of time. Where can people find you if they want to ask you some of the questions that didn't get answered, or just follow your work, read your stuff?
Okay, well, first of all, I will be around at Write the Docs today and tomorrow. It is absolutely fair game to spot me in the hallway, in the chat channels, or I don't know, in the hall, wherever. So I'm always open to that. Other good places to find me, I'm on Mastodon. In theory, I'm on Twitter, but my notification's been broken for years. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or just mention me and I will try to respond. I think there's, and yeah, all of the channels, lornajane.net is a great place to see what I'm up to. And I do post to my blog there as well. So that can be a nice way to hear a little bit more about what I'm thinking about in this space.
Oh my God, amazing. Thank you for opening our conference. And yeah, see you around then next few days.